thank you for being here. And I'm really, really appreciative of the opportunity to be with you and to present this series of lessons. The series is on Created for Connection. And so it's all about marriage relationships. Now, last week and this week, there's not a lot specifically about marriage, although last week we talked about the human brain, and this week we're talking about self-understanding. But it's really vitally important that we understand how these things work and especially how they affect our relationships. Just very quickly, this is what is upcoming. Next week, God's plan for marriage. And I think a lot of people, especially people who are in this class, really do understand what God intended when He set us up in marriage relationships. But we're also going to talk about not only God's plan, but what we do to mess it up. And we can really, really mess it up. And then the week after that, the chemistry of love. This is a really important thing when we talk about what we feel, what our body does when we are attracted to and when we are infatuated with somebody else, and how that changes once the infatuation phase dies down and subsides. September 28th, the signs of attraction. What are some of the things that bring us together? 2 weeks after that, disconnection and safety. The things that bring us together initially in relationships are far different from the things that keep us together in our relationships. And we got outlines there? Thank you so much. I appreciate that. And then the last week of the series, we're going to be talking about safe conversations. The question, just a quick recap. Last week we talked about brain plasticity and neural pathways, and how that when the pathways change, everything changes. And that's just very, very recent findings about the human brain. The question was asked earlier about last week's video, and I think it's at the bottom of the outline. Is there a web link there to last week? So my faithful and true webmaster, Donnie Claxton, sitting in the corner over there. I told him that's where he has to sit, and not misbehave and not call attention to himself. He worked really, really hard. He got the feed from the Prestonwood audiovisual people, and he edited it, and it's online now. It's ready to view for those of you who are so inclined, or if you know someone who might be interested in that, then feel free to forward that to them. So last week we talked about how there are certain things that we need to dwell on. What we dwell on is what is going to direct the paths of our lives. And so Philippians 4:8 is a verse that you're very, very familiar with. And Paul writes, "Finally, brethren, whatever things are true, whatever things are noble, whatever things are just, whatever things are pure, whatever things are lovely, whatever things are of good report, if there's any virtue and if there's anything praiseworthy, think on these things, dwell on these things, meditate on these things, focus on these things." Where we get messed up is when we focus on the wrong things. We focus on anxiety, or we focus on what might go wrong, or we focus on what is wrong, and especially in our marriages. I used some examples of this last week, that when we focus on what's wrong with him, what's wrong with her, the focus on how unhappy I am, how unbearably unhappy I am, how I don't think I'm ever going to be happy as long as I'm in this marriage. When we focus and dwell on those things, those neural pathways become more and more strong, and it becomes more and more difficult to change the way that we think. Also, we looked last week about at Matthew 6:33, and when Jesus in the Sermon on the Mount is saying, don't worry about your food, don't worry about your attire, don't worry about the things of this life. If you seek first, dwell on, focus on, meditate on, seek first His kingdom and His righteousness, then we know what happens. All of these things that we really need to survive, survival needs, they'll be added to us. We'll have those as long as our focus is on the right, in the right direction. And so the question that I love with this cartoon, where the husband, who just happens to be named Harold, is sitting on the couch reading his newspaper, and his wife turns to him and says, "Harold, who are you really?" And I could just see him thinking, I just want to read my newspaper. I don't want to talk about this. But that's a very existential question. Who are you really? Who am I really? Where did we get all this stuff? And the main question about our marriages is what are we bringing with us into our marriage relationships? So the next cartoon is the businessman lying on the couch, and he says, "I'm competitive, cruel, glad when my friends fail, and so envious when they succeed that I wish them nothing but evil. Other than that, I have no idea why I'm here." And so that's a simple little comical example. These are some things, and he doesn't have any idea. He's telling the truth about that. But those characteristics, those traits, came from somewhere. They were learned somewhere. And if he brings those same characteristics into his marriage relationship, then there's going to be lots of problems that will result. Okay, we'll start with our reading tonight and then come back to it a little bit later. Reading is from John 13, 1 through 5. Now, before the feast of the Passover, this is right near the end of Jesus' ministry, right near the end of his life, right in the shadow of the cross. Before the feast of the Passover, when Jesus knew that his hour had come, that he should depart from this world to the Father, having loved his own who were in the world, he loved them to the end. And supper being ended, the devil having already put into the heart of Judas Iscariot, Simon's son, to betray him, Jesus, knowing that the Father had given all things into his hands, and that he had come from God and was going to God, rose from supper and laid aside his garments, took a towel, and girded himself. After that, he poured water into a basin and began to wash the disciples' feet, and wipe them with the towel with which he was girded. Just a quick, we're going to look at this in a little bit more detail before the evening is over. But notice in the previous section there, three things that Jesus knew. Jesus knew that the Father had given all things into his hands. See, he knew his purpose for being on the earth. Well, of course he did. He knew that he had come from God. He knew his origins, and he knew that he was going to God. He knew his destination. So it's been said that the three most important questions in life are where did I come from, who am I, and where am I going? Well, that's in a very, very small, really important nutshell. Jesus knew all of those things about himself, and what that did was it enabled him to be authentic and genuine, and in this particular context, enabled him to get up from supper, put a towel around his waist, and wash the dirty feet of his disciples. We'll come back to that. So we talk about self-understanding, the art of understanding ourselves. Can you finish that? Well, I just did it for you. The unexamined life is not worth living. Does anyone know the origins of that statement? Who said it? Huh? Socrates? Who said Socrates? You get the Cupid doll. That's exactly right. Socrates said that he was on trial for heresy because as a teacher he was teaching his students to ask questions and to ask difficult questions and not to accept just everything that was being taught that day without asking about it, without examining it. Well, Socrates got in some trouble about that, and so he was convicted of some kind of heresy, and so he said, without the examined life, there's no point in living. They gave him an opportunity to. He was sentenced to death. They gave him an opportunity to live if he would just recant his teachings and not teach those things anymore. That's what he said. The unexamined life is not worth living. It's not worth living, staying alive, if I can't ask these questions and teach my students to ask those questions. And so most people, we don't have to choose between life and self-understanding today. My experience is, my belief is, that most people don't live lives that are examined, that are very, very fully examined. And as I think that a lot of people, we just kind of walk through life or kind of blunder through life, and we do what we've always done or do what we were taught to do, and don't ask very many questions about it. I don't know if you believe that or not, but why would you say that self-understanding and self-examination is not a very common factor in most people's lives? Got any ideas?
People don't want to face the facts.
Okay, yeah, and I may not want to know where I came from. There may be pain involved. It may be frightening to me to ask those questions, and so it's a little bit easier maybe to live in denial. What else?
Probably can't do anything about it anyhow.
They think that's the case. A lot of people think what's done is done. What is done can't be undone. And that's where I take exception with that. I think that there are certain things, and we'll see this in a few minutes, there are certain things that we can't do anything about. But there are a lot of patterns and habits and things in our lives that we can do something about. Even though it's been a long time since we've grown up and lived with our families and learned some of the lessons we've learned. It does take time. It does take effort. There may be pain and discomfort. And what happens if I learn of something that I need to change? Well, then there's kind of an expectation that I'm going to change. Maybe I don't want to change that much, or maybe I'm afraid of change. Anyway, I think there are a lot of people who don't do it. We just talked about some reasons why. My experience is when people do look at themselves and examine their lives, that some of the triggers are going to be a crisis. Had a counseling session just this afternoon with a family, a father and a mother and a 15-year-old son. They were in crisis. And it's really a very, very upsetting crisis for them and for me. And they are saying, what can we do? What can we change? How can we change? Well, that's not an unusual, and it's a good question. Those are good questions. It's not an unusual thing for people who are in crisis or who have experienced trauma or who have experienced repeated self-defeating behaviors or repeated failed relationships. Very, very early in my counseling career, I met with a guy, and this was a very intelligent young man. He was 35 years old. He was a professional man. I think he was a CPA. And he was coming to see me because at 35, he was going through his third divorce. And so I thought, well, yeah, that's something to find out more about. And so I asked him to share with me, tell me about each of your marriages, just a nutshell version here. Each of your marriages, how did they begin, how did they deteriorate, and how did they end? And he told me basically the same story 3 times, that he had repeated the same relationship with 3 different women, 3 different times. And so it was so simple and so obvious to me, it would have been obvious to you as well, that I asked him the question. I said, do you see the similarities? And he had that look on his face like the deer in the headlights. I mean, it was just like he had never, this is a smart guy. He had never examined enough of himself and his relationships that he saw any similarities in that. And so that's those are some of the triggers for people who do come into my office. So here's about Jesus, and one of the really important things about Jesus is that he knew who he was. And John 13, illustrates that. Whatever else may be said about him, he was genuine and he was authentic. There were no pretensions. He didn't wear any facades, any false masks. He wasn't trying to play a role. He was being who he really was. He had nothing to hide, and his genuineness can really be seen throughout the Gospels. He was straightforward with everyone and forthright. And aren't those qualities that, I am drawn to people like that. I like people like that, who are not trying to pull something over on me and not trying to be something they are not. I really appreciate that, and I think most people do. So what we see is in John 13, the Father had given all things to him. He had come from God. He was going to God. And what that enabled him to be was genuine and authentic, and to be truly free and who he was. See, and one other thing I'm going to throw in here that's not in John's Gospel, but it's in Luke's Gospel of this same event, what had been happening at supper before Jesus got up and put the towel around his waist and got the basin and knelt down to wash the feet. Do you remember what the disciples had been talking about? Yeah. Who's going to be what's our status? Father, Jesus, when you come into your kingdom, and of course they were still expecting an earthly kingdom, we want to make sure that it's understood that I'm going to be on the right hand, my brother's going to be on the left hand. Who's going to be the greatest in the kingdom? And I can just see Jesus without saying a word, and after 3 years, 2.5 to 3 years with these guys, and they're still doing this. Oh my goodness! Can you imagine? He got up without saying a word, put the towel around his waist, and started washing feet. Wow. What a lesson that is. Jesus knew himself, and because he knew himself, he was free. He was free to be who he was. And so what I'm saying, this is real authenticity and real genuineness. And so I want to play this video for you. Some of you, maybe most of you, are familiar with this the Christian song "Priceless," and I want to put that in this because we're going to go on after this song, and we're going to talk about why I am who I am and why you are who you are. But I wanted to lay the groundwork for that with this video. It's actually just the words of the video. The words of the song, but it's when we look in a mirror, we see certain characteristics. But it's very, very different from how the Father sees us. And that's what this is all about. So see if we've got any. Needs song. Needs song in it. I think this is a good example of something that the Father wants us to dwell on. Not what we see in the mirror, but what we see through his eyes. He knows us better than we know ourselves. We already know that. And so I wish I could find this cartoon. I looked for it, couldn't find it. It's a cartoon of how we see flowers. And so it's just this bouquet of really beautiful flowers. And then the next panel is how flowers see themselves. And one of them's cross-eyed, one of them has buck teeth, one of has the petals missing. So maybe flowers have the same problem with self-image and self-esteem that we have. But I know that I can, and I suspect that you can really do a number on yourself too. That's not who we really are. Who we really are is seeing ourselves through the eyes of the Father. Now, having laid that groundwork, I'm going to go into three specific things. This is an oversimplification, but it's all very, very true. Three things that make us who we are. And as we go through these, in the context of our marriages, I want you to be thinking about what are some of the problems when we bring these things with us into our marriage. Especially if we don't know what we're doing, if we're not sure why, what is it that triggers my anger, for example? If I may say, well, I've always had an anger problem, but I don't have any idea where it comes from. Well, you can guarantee yourself, or I'll guarantee you, that if you get married or when you get married, that anger is going to get triggered. And that can do some real serious damage. The better we understand ourselves, the more in control of ourselves we're going to be. If I understand who I am and where those characteristics come from. So listen to all of this in the context of our marriages and our relationships. So three characteristics that three factors that we all bring because this is part of who we are. Number one, there are genetic predispositions. Every single one of us is born with a unique genetic code. Nobody is a blank slate at birth. We come with all kinds of predispositions. In fact, I'm just going to say we don't even know, like I said last week about the human brain, we don't even know how much we don't know right now. It's the masterpiece of the human being, and the human being is the masterpiece of God's creation. So the brain is the masterpiece of the masterpiece. We bring a unique genetic code that has to do with physical features, and you can see this from generation to generation, how children look like one parent or maybe both parents or grandparents or whomever. But we also bring with us genetically some temperamental characteristics and some behavioral traits and emotional tendencies. So we bring with us predispositions. We know this is a fact. I mentioned this last week, that if my father was an alcoholic and his brothers were alcoholics and his father was an alcoholic, and then I better pay very, very close attention to alcohol, because I may in fact have a genetic predisposition to alcoholism or drug abuse. But we also know when somebody comes into an office like mine and they're depressed, I want to know, is there anybody else in your family who has some of these same characteristics? Mom, dad, siblings, grandparents, aunts, uncles, because we know that there are predispositions for depression and for anxiety, just to name a few. So, without spending any more time on that, one of the challenges is to be aware. Ask questions. Ask questions of your family members. My parents have been gone now for many years, and very regularly I just have this thought. I said, I wish I'd asked Dad about that, And you probably have experienced something like that if you've lost a parent or a grandparent. We didn't think to ask all the things that we think about now that we'd like to ask. So genetic predispositions are one set of factors. Another set of factors is what I call unchangeable factors surrounding my birth and early years. So these are things that we can't change. When were you born? This is a really profound statement I'm getting ready to make, but the only way to not be as old as you are right now is to not have been born so soon. Okay? And maybe some of us would go back and change that if we had the power, but thankfully we don't have the power. But the time in which we were born has a lot to do with the person we become. Both my parents were they were teenagers and young adults during the Great Depression. Now, people who lived through that time, that made a deep impression on their lives. They wouldn't spend And they wouldn't let us, they didn't want to spend anything on anything because they had seen how many people had been very, very adversely affected by the Great Depression. I was born in 1948, so I turned 18 in 1966, right? What was going on in 1966? Why is that significant? Yeah, Vietnam. What did you have to? That was back in the day. What did you have to do when you turned 18 as a male? You had to register for the draft. Wow. I had some friends, high school friends, who got drafted, who went to Vietnam. There were a couple of guys in the class ahead of mine who didn't come back alive from Vietnam. Now,
What was the number, Duncan? Everybody knows that.
oh yeah, mine was 247 in the lottery.
Yeah.
See, but I registered before there was even a lottery. But and it's luck of the draw. I mean, clearly, yeah, everybody remembers their lottery number. So when were you born, and what was going on in the world when you were born? What was going on in you, in your culture, in your community? Where you were born has a lot to do with who you are and who I am. So other questions, and just a smattering of these questions. Were you wanted as a child? If you were, how did you know that? If you weren't, how did you know that? I knew a family at church one time where they had 4 children. Their last 2 were Mark and Tim, and so the father was introducing me to them when they were teenagers. Mark is our last child. Tim is our very last child. So Tim was not expected, but he was also loved and valued. Was it safe growing up in the family that you grew up in? Were you valued? Did you feel like people surrounded you with love and had your back and took care of you? Or, well, I won't go into any detail. A lot of these things go into a great deal of detail. What was the socioeconomic situation of the family in which you grew up? What were the religious values and practices? What were the educational factors, influences on your life? Did you come from a family that valued education? So I got to, this is a very personal thing, but I got to share this with you. This is Della and Harold. Harold Sr. I'm Harold Jr. by the way. Della was born in 1911 in Middle Tennessee. Harold was born in 1910, and he was one of 12 siblings. He was the youngest of 12. He's the only one in his family, of his siblings who went to college. They were poor. They worked the farm. They lived off of the farm. But he had an opportunity to go to college, and he did. Mom was from a more of a family that I think most of her siblings, including her, went to college. But the reason I'm showing that picture is that picture in that frame was something that was on a bookshelf when the family and in the home where I was growing up. I looked at that every day. You think that made an impression on me? The impression that made is, and they didn't even have to say this, son, education is very important. And the unspoken is, yeah, you will go to college. I mean, it wasn't a question. Now, I know not everybody has that opportunity, and I'm very grateful that I had that opportunity. But it's one of those things that when I was growing up, I didn't think that much about it, but some deep imprints were being made. Genetic predispositions, unchangeable factors surrounding my birth and early years, and there are just hundreds of those if we had time. I'll mention just 2 or 3 more. How old were my parents when I was born? How old were your parents when you were born? It's different if you're born to parents who are 16 years old as opposed to being born to parents who are 36 years old, right? Were your parents married? If so, how long had they been? How long had they been married? What was your parents' relationship like with each other? What was modeled for you when you were growing up about marriage? You may have been in a blended family. There may have been step-parents, not necessarily a negative factor. I counsel with people frequently who said, yeah, I was raised by my biological mom and her second husband, my stepdad, but he was wonderful. He was very, very nurturing and very loving. So what about grandparents? Was there a death in the family when you were growing up? Was there a divorce? Was there alcoholism? Was there drug abuse? And these are all factors that you didn't have anything to do with, but that made a real impact on you. You can't go back and change them, but it's really, really important to understand those. The third set of factors are what makes me who I am, why I am who I am. Learned behavior patterns. These are the ones that can be changed because what has been learned can be unlearned and relearned. Okay? So some of the questions we ask in a counseling session are about, one, about affection. How is affection expressed in your family? Was it very open or was it awkward? Was it comfortable? Was it direct? Was it indirect? Was it verbal? Was it nonverbal? And so when a son and a father and son, he may be expressing affection to his son. He may reach over and just tap him on the shoulder like that. And so sometimes we call that warm knuckles. It's a sign of affection. Maybe that's the best that dad can do at that particular moment. Maybe he's not comfortable hugging. Maybe he's very uncomfortable saying, I love you. But he can wrestle with his son. He can play ball with his son. He can do lots of things that communicate his affection. What about conflicts? How were conflicts handled in the family that you grew up in? Were they handled openly and directly? Did your family pretend they didn't exist? Was there pouting? Was there anger? Was there rage? Was there violence? And so when two people come together in a marriage and he comes from a family where conflicts were handled openly and directly, but she not so much, then when they have a conflict, that's generally how they're going to approach it. And sometimes that is not going to work very well. They're going to have to find some common ground that they can both feel comfortable with. What about communication? How was communication done in the family in which you grew up? Was it direct? Did people talk directly to each other and honestly and openly? Was it indirect? Was it hidden? Was it manipulative? Did Dad look at Mom and say, you tell that son of yours that he better do his homework? Well, the son's sitting right there at the table. But for some reason, we're going through a third party. I'll be honest, my family, we didn't talk a whole lot when I was growing up about feelings. And I grew up kind of not asking a whole lot of questions. So when Joy and I got married and she met my parents and getting to know them a little bit better, and she'll ask anything. I thought, good grief. Why are you asking all these questions? We're sitting around with my mom and dad. I knew my dad's dad died when my dad was 15 years old. I knew that much, that he had lost his dad when he was a teenager. And so we're sitting around, and Joy just pipes up and asks, well, and everybody called my dad Dunk. Dunk, how did your father die? And he said he killed himself. And she looks over at me like, why don't I know this? Why haven't you told me this? I said, I didn't know it until this very moment. I never asked how my dad died. I never thought about asking, but my dad was very matter-of-fact about it and kind of explained the circumstances. But, that's good. You marry a woman who'll just talk about anything, you don't know then what's going to come up next. But that's one of the differences in her and me. So what about power? Who had power in the family that you grew up in? How was it used? Power is not a negative thing, but it can be used very negatively. How were decisions made? How were disagreements handled? And really the question then becomes, in my marriage today, how do I express affection? How do I handle conflicts, communication, and power, and expectations and demands? What were some of the expectations that you experienced as a child? And what demands were made on you? What about addiction? Was there addiction in the family? Was there abuse or neglect in the family that you grew up in? What about successes and failures? What about work patterns and play patterns? One of the things I'm eternally grateful to my parents for is they were both really, really hard workers, had a very, very strong work ethic, and I think that I do as well. But they also knew that there was time to play, and there was time to stop work, and there was time to have fun. And so work patterns, play patterns, self-concept. I want to share with you one more little diagram here. Have you ever heard of the Johari window? Any of you? Okay. This is a little diagram about what we know about ourselves and what others know about us. I used to think that it was Johari came from some Eastern, special mystic bit of wisdom. And what I found out is that the two guys in Chicago who actually developed this, one of them was named Joe and one was named Harry. And so they just combined their names and they called it the Johari window. It's a true story, and you can find some really good stuff on the internet if you want to look this up. But I'm going to give you a little abbreviated version here. The total of the window, all four quadrants, represent everything there is to know about me and about you. And so the four quadrants are described as such. The first quadrant is called the open quadrant because that's the stuff that I know about myself and the stuff that you know about me. So just visually, you can look at me, you can see what I look like, you can see what I'm wearing. I looked at myself in the mirror and I saw what I was like. You know some stuff on the outline, you know a little bit about my education, my credentials, and what I do. So those are things you know about me, but most of us don't know each other much beyond that. And so there's a little bit of stuff, there's a lot that I know about myself, not so much that you know about me. The second quadrant is the blind quadrant. This is stuff that I don't know about myself, but you know about me. So I've got this little piece of lettuce in my teeth, and I'm talking to you. I don't know that it's there, but it's really obvious, and you're very embarrassed for me if you see that. You may notice if I'm talking to you and I kind of keep looking down at the ground and looking around, I may have trouble with eye contact. Now, I may not really fully understand that, but it's very obvious to you. I had a doctor one time who would clear his he couldn't get through a sentence without clearing his throat. I mean, half a dozen times. I don't think he knew that he was doing that. I'm saying, just say it. Quit doing that. And okay, but the stuff that's unknown to me but known to you, the third quadrant is what is known to me but unknown to you. Now, there's quite a bit of stuff there, especially when you don't know somebody very well or you just meet somebody. But the better the friends you are with somebody, you know the stuff about you and they know it about you as well. The fourth quadrant is what we call the blind quadrant. Because that's stuff that I don't know about myself and you don't know about me either. But throughout the course of life, we learn stuff about ourselves. That may have always been there. We just didn't know it until it bubbled up to the surface for one reason or another. So the key to this Johari window is that the quadrants are not all the same size. And so that would be represented in the next with an enlarged quadrant. I'm sorry, you have an enlarged quadrant number 2. What would that indicate if and the other quadrants shrink in size according to the size of the dominant one. What would that quadrant what would that indicate about you or me? Pardon? Yeah, I'm pretty clueless about myself. There's lots of things that you will know about me that I don't know about myself. Completely out of touch, lack of self-awareness. On the other hand, if the quadrant number 3 is larger, then what would that indicate? Yeah, I'm very private, and I'm also very hidden. I'm not very open. Maybe I don't have a lot of self-confidence. I know a whole lot of stuff about me that I'm not letting anybody else know to the best of my ability, or maybe only just a few people. So the quadrant sizes change according to the relationship that we are in. So what if you are typically this person who has a lot of stuff that we know about ourselves, but not really comfortable or confident sharing that. And I'm in a marriage with somebody. It's a fairly new marriage. What kind of problem might that indicate? Say again? Yeah, intimacy issues, to say the least, a lot more. And if I'm the person with the large quadrant 3 and my wife is trying to pull things out of me, tell me more about yourself, tell me more, and I'm resistant to that, then there's not going to be as great a level of connection as we want to have, as most of us are going to feel comfortable having. So the larger quadrant 1, here's where it all kind of comes down to a conclusion here. Larger quadrant 1 indicates what? Yeah, I know quite a bit about myself, and what's the second part of that? Yeah. Say again? Yeah, transparency is a great word. Authenticity is a great word. Genuineness is a great word. It just means that I know myself very well, and I'm confident enough that I'm going to let you know me too. I'm not going to be self-conscious about that. I'm not going to be hidden. It's kind of the what you see is what you get kind of thing. And my belief is that this is what we want to strive for. This is what I want to strive for. I want to know as much about myself as I can. And I want to be comfortable and confident enough about who I am, who I really am, that we said this about Jesus earlier tonight in the lesson. I'm not going to play any games. I'm not going to wear any masks. I'm not going to try to fool you or keep the real me from you or my wife or from anybody else. I want to be transparent. I want to be authentic. I want to be genuine. And I think those are the characteristics that are going to bode well for a good, connected, safe relationship. So what that indicates is that there really are two primary objectives in achieving the large quadrant number 1. Awareness of who I am, what I'm doing, and where I'm going, and the confidence, learning to be comfortable with who I really am without embarrassment or self-consciousness, so that when I meet somebody new, I can talk. I can talk very openly and freely and comfortably about who I am. I'm not having to be somebody or try to be somebody who I really am not. Let me see what I've left out. Oh, okay. The challenge of this is this is a process that doesn't come real easily and doesn't come real naturally. It requires effort and time and energy. The other thing that I want to close on is this, and I'll take this back up next week. When a married couple comes for couples counseling into my office or an office like mine, they almost always bring with them two characteristics. One of those is disconnection. Somewhere along the way, they have gotten disconnected emotionally from each other. Didn't start off that way. And probably, and sometimes, they didn't do this intentionally. They didn't intentionally disconnect from each other. But life happens. And so when children are born, that's a blessing, but it's also a crisis point in relationships, because when you have children, it takes everything else that you've got. It takes all your time and all your money and all your energy, and sometimes what suffers there is the marital relationship. You already know that, and some of you may have lived through that. But disconnection is one thing that couples bring with them into the counseling session. The other characteristic that they bring is a lack of safety, emotional safety with each other. The person that I stood in front of the church and before God and promised to love and to honor and to cherish until we're dead. And somehow along the way, I don't feel safe opening up, or she doesn't feel safe telling me everything that's so important for us to know about each other. There was a book written probably 35 years ago. It was entitled, it still is entitled this, Why Am I Afraid to Tell You Who I Really Am? Why am I afraid to tell you who I really am? The answer is, I'm afraid to tell you who I really am because if I tell you who I really am, you may not like me. And that's all I got. I don't have anything else. When I put all my cards on the table, if you don't accept me and you don't like me, then that's all I got. That's what a lot of us fear. That's one of the reasons why sometimes we don't feel safe telling that person that we're the closest to in the world some of the things that we need to share and some of the things that they need to share with us. Okay, paying very, very close attention to the time. I teach a class at SMU. I teach primarily I teach two classes in the SMU master's program. One of those is marriage and family therapy, and a lot of what is being said in these lessons comes from that class. The other class that I teach is called Family of Origin. It's understanding all of the ramifications of the family that I grew up in. It's probably my favorite class. Every time I teach it, of course, you know, those of you who are teachers, we learn more than we can impart to our students. But I'll just say this, no matter how old you are, however long it's been since you've lived with your family that you grew up in, they still have an impact on you today. And so I hear people in my office say, no, that was a long time ago, doesn't mean anything in my life right now. Well, he's wrong. He's wrong about that. And I will I'll diplomatically tell him that he's wrong. I may say, you may want to rethink that because it's not true. But the better we know ourselves, including family of origin, including genetic predispositions, including our unchangeable factors, including our learned behavior patterns, the better we know ourselves, then the better we are going to be able to handle our relationships and communicate in our marriages. Thank you very much for your very, very kind attention, and thank you for that. I'm looking forward to getting back into next week, God's plan and how we mess it up, because there's some really, really important ways that we mess it up. Let's say a brief prayer before we leave, please. Father in heaven, thank you so very much for this evening, and thank you for every person who is here. And thank you for giving me the opportunity to share these thoughts and these learnings with a class like this. And I pray that you will guide us and help us all to have stronger, more vibrant, more healthy, more connected, and more safe relationships, and help us to be dedicated and devoted to keep moving in that direction with your love and your support and your guidance. And we pray in your Son's name. Amen. Thank you very much.